Imagine for a moment historians of the distant future, grappling with the question of which event best described the latter 20th century. Would it be the explosion of the first atomic bomb, or the emergence of the internet, or even the astonishing creation of 500 channels of television without anything much worth watching? Perhaps. But then again, it just might be the moment on June the 24th, 1947, when the pilot of a single-engine plane, a salesman named Kenneth Arnold, was amazed to see 9 metallic objects zooming past Mount Rainier at impossible speeds. Flying, he said, like saucers would if you skipped them on water. In the following weeks, thousands of reports of flying saucers flooded in from much of the world. In the shadow of the atomic age, the era of UFOs had begun.
We lived our little drama, we kissed in a field of white, and stars fell on Alabama.
But why is this event so important that it should even be mentioned alongside the most expressive milestones of the last century?
We bring you this special radio television broadcast in order to give you the very latest information on an amazing phenomenon.
So this is the story of how that happened, and it begins, if it has a beginning, in the Pacific Northwest on the 24th of June, 1947. While he was flying home to Idaho at the end of a business trip, Kenneth Arnold spent an hour searching for a downed plane in the wilderness of Washington state. It was a bright sunny day with perfect visibility, but he had no luck. Arnold sold forest fire fighting equipment, hopping about the Northwest in his single-engine Call Air. As he turned towards home, a blinding flash of light caught his attention. He located its source as sunlight reflecting off the metallic surface of 9 objects flying south past Mount Rainier. Arnold clocked their speed over the 47-mile distance to Mount Adams at 1,800 miles an hour, almost 4 times faster than any plane known to be flying at the time. Thinking they might be test craft and 1,800 miles an hour was too fast to even contemplate, he cut it to 1,200 miles an hour when he reported what he'd seen to a local newspaper. The story was picked up by the AP wire service, and a headline writer labeled them flying saucers.
He certainly had to be flying in a very strong inversion. The possibilities of there being optical illusions in that situation was something that was a possibility. The mirages do seem to be moving and moving fast.
If it's a mountaintop mirage, which he's talking about, they stay above the tops of the mountains. They don't move laterally. And they fade in and out. And, of course, they appear to be inverted images of the top of the mountain. Another more recent explanation was geese. The most recent one, which has actually led to a new terminology in ufology called pelicanism, where you take an explanation which seems, to me anyway, a careful analysis to be totally ridiculous, and you push it as hard as you can. Ornithologists think it could be pelicans. Pelicans can be very bright when reflecting sunlight.
And apparently they can move quite fast, clocked on Arnold's watch merrily gliding along at 1,800 miles an hour. Meteors have also been suggested, though how meteors could have traveled for 47 plus miles horizontally has never been explained, nor how they could resemble what Arnold drew. Even though there had been dozens of local reports of strange aerial objects in the preceding months, Arnold's sightings seemed to open a floodgate. Within weeks, there were more than 3,000 reports from across North America and around the world. Perhaps, it's been suggested, people were collectively suffering some trauma-induced delusion, a reaction to the threat of mass destruction of a scale never seen before.
The motion picture spectacle of all time. 1,000,000 tons of water alive with deadly rays. Awe-inspiring in its significance for man who learned how to control the atom, but must now learn to control himself.
In the midst of the 1947 flying saucer wave, on July the 7th, the Army Air Force Base at Roswell, New Mexico, the home of the only atomic bomb wing in the world, issued a press release that it had recovered a crashed disc. The DJ at radio station KGFL says he was the first to get the release from Walter Hout, the base PR officer.
He hands me this release, and he runs out. He said, "You got 30 minutes," and he's practically running out the door. And I'm looking at it, and I saw, flying saucer, and I said, "Wait a minute, Walter," and I'm going out hollering after him. He said, "I got to get back to the base. You got 30 minutes." I couldn't get him to stop. So I had to wait because he said he's going back to his office, had his number, called, got him. I said, "Walter, don't run this story. If you do, you're going to be in trouble. They'll ship you out to Siberia." I remember mentioning that. That was a common phrase in those days. And he said, "Look," he said, "the old man has cleared this. It's okay to use it."
The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
About that time, all hell broke loose. The wire went dead, and the phones began to ring.
And the cavalry came to the rescue. The next day at Fort Worth headquarters, General Roger Ramey informed a breathless media that the intelligence officers of the only A-bomb base in the U.S. arsenal had mistaken a common weather balloon for a crashed flying saucer. The press ran the story without so much as an arched eyebrow. And that was the last we'd hear of Roswell for another 35 years, when it would begin to blow up into the culture with all the power of an atomic bomb.
The long-awaited unification of the armed services comes a step nearer.
A few weeks after Roswell, the signing of the National Securities Act reorganized the armed forces and established the CIA and the National Security Council.
The Iron Curtain has descended across the continent.
The Cold War was officially underway. By August, flying saucer reports had dropped, and the press had pretty well assigned the subject to the crank file. After all, no one had seen or photographed one close up, and the military was at least publicly making light of the whole idea. But behind the scenes, things were different.
This was something that the intelligence community took seriously immediately. There was a desk called the Collections Desk in the Pentagon that was interested in dangerous possible invasions of American airspace. And this looked like that well could be what this was all about.
The Pentagon sent a request for an evaluation to Air Materiel Command at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. After a preliminary intelligence gathering, a memo was sent back to the Pentagon by Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, the commanding officer of Air Materiel Command. It concluded that the phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious, and that the extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, and motion, which must be considered evasive when sighted or contacted by friendly aircraft and radar, lend belief to the possibility that some of the objects are controlled.
The natural belief was that this must be Soviet technology. The idea that it was extraterrestrial did not really come up there at the very beginning.
Finally, Twining's memo went on to recommend a detailed codename study. Project Sign was approved at the end of December as part of the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It immediately had to contend with a disaster. An Air Force plane had gone down, chasing a UFO. On January 7, 1948, Kentucky Air National Guard Captain Thomas F. Mantell's F-51 fighter fell to Earth. He had been chasing a strange object in the sky. The Air Force accident investigators concluded that Captain Thomas F. Mantell had blacked out from lack of oxygen at 25,000 feet. 5 minutes earlier, he had radioed that he had spotted the object high above him and was climbing to get a closer look. He described it as metallic and tremendous in size. After Mantell apparently lost consciousness, his plane had climbed to 30,000 feet when it stalled and began its death spiral to Earth. News that a pilot had died chasing a flying saucer shot across the wires. The Air Force investigators announced that Mantell had died chasing the planet Venus, an explanation that seemed ridiculous given his description and eyewitness accounts of a large, slow-moving, cone-shaped object. In the early 50s, the Air Force's Project Blue Book revisited the case and concluded that the object was a top-secret Navy skyhook balloon used to study cosmic rays. However, it was under the shadow cast by the tragedy that the members of the Air Force's Project Sign began their investigation into flying saucers. Throughout the winter and spring of 1948, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Building T-2, they began to grapple with the fact that whatever they were, the saucers weren't foreign or secret domestic technology. Investigators went out into the field to quietly talk to people, many of them military, who had filed reports. By March, they had over 300 made by observers they considered competent. By summer, a debate was raging within the Sign team whether some of the objects reported were extraterrestrial. Then one night in July, an extraordinary incident unfolded.
The case that turned the corner for Project Sign has gone by the name of the Childs Whitted case, out of the two airline pilots that were the prime witnesses in the case.
Eastern Airlines Flight 576 was 20 miles south of Montgomery, Alabama at 2:45 in the morning of July the 24th, when Captain Clarence S. Childs and First Officer John V. Whitted saw an elongated wingless craft flash by their plane at what they estimated as 700 miles an hour. Both men described the object as metallic, with two lighted rows of windows. On Pentagon instructions, Sign investigators hurriedly flew off to interview Childs and Whitted. They were impressed with the two men's certainty that what they saw was a manufactured object. The Sign team was also aware of a report the week before from the Netherlands of a similar two-tiered craft, and other reports from across Europe of wingless planes. Within days of the Childs-Whitted sighting, the Sign team had committed to a conclusion.
The reason why Project Sign saw this case as being extraterrestrial was that this was an object flying freely and apparently maneuverably in our environment that had no wings. So where would the lift for a piloted craft of some kind come from? What they knew as technologists at Wright-Pat was the only way such an object could fly is if it had a tremendously powerful energy source. And the only thing they could think of would be something like nuclear. But they knew that they had nothing nuclear and no one else did either. They were stuck with the conclusion that this was an extraterrestrial device.
As traffic backed up with employees leaving Wright-Pat at the end of the midsummer workdays, the Sign team was hunkered down writing what they must have seen as one of the most important documents ever written. It was an estimate of the situation, required of all military investigations once they reach a conclusion. The estimate was then sent to the Pentagon, where it circulated to a very mixed reaction.
The majority of the people in the Pentagon at the time thought that this was not a message that they wanted to send out into the world or even into the military community itself, that this was just too strange and too dangerous. It was like an unknown wild card that they didn't want to let psychologically loose within their people.
The estimate worked its way up to the desk of Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg, who was, we can assume, thrilled to see it. As what he did with the estimate is a crucial juncture in this story, it's worthwhile to consider his decision options. He could 1. Reject the estimate straight away and bury its conclusions. 2. Order further study, which would serve to keep its conclusions alive with the possibility of leaks. Or 3. Accept the conclusions, which would mean admitting to the Congress, the President, and the American people that the Air Force was powerless to prevent extraterrestrials of unknown origin, and worse, unknown intent, from overflying the United States. Researchers who believe that a flying saucer crashed at Roswell are of the opinion that Vandenberg's decision was made to perpetuate a cover-up. But Roswell is not necessary to understand why the estimate was quashed. Simple convenience suffices. The idea it advocated was dangerous, the effect on the population unpredictable. Authority fears and loathes one thing above all. Vandenberg let it be known to the SIGN team that their conclusions had no supporting evidence. All copies of the estimate were ordered destroyed. The SIGN team was disbanded and replaced by Project Grudge, whose mandate apparently was to give the public mundane explanations for all sightings, and shift the emphasis from the reports to the people making them. Flying saucers were to be a psychological problem. In December of 1948, just as Project SIGN was being replaced by the Saucers Don't Exist Project Grudge, a series of sightings called the Green Fireballs began over sensitive military installations in New Mexico. They were seen by dozens of scientists at the Los Alamos Nuclear Research Installation and by hundreds of military personnel. At least 39 reports were sent to Grudge by April of '49. There was great concern in the scientific community about what they were, but Project Grudge, true to its name, seemed to begrudge all requests to investigate. A few months later, Grudge cooperated with the Saturday Evening Post on a major two-part article debunking saucers, only to see sightings immediately hit an all-time high. 2 days after the article, a fateful telegram arrived on the desk of a retired Marine major and former aide to Charles Lindbergh, now a successful journalist. Have been investigating flying saucer mystery. First tip hinted gigantic hoax to cover up official secret. Believe it may have been planted to hide real answer. Looks like terrific story. Can you take over Washington End? Ken W. Purdy, editor, True Magazine. Initially skeptical, Donald Kehoe took the assignment and began 6 months of research drawing on his extensive contacts in the military. The subject of flying saucers would never be the same. Meanwhile, through the rest of 1949, the team at Project Grudge did their best to shoot down any and all sightings. They were aided in their mission by their new astronomer consultant, J. Allen Hynek.
Hynek was very skeptical. From the beginning, he assumed that all reports were explainable in conventional terms. And that is, in fact, what he did. That was his function for the Air Force. They would take the cases to them and they say, we can't explain this, as we can't trace a weather balloon. Is this a comet, a meteor, a planet? And Hynek would provide the explanation.
Donald Kehoe's True Magazine article appeared just before New Year's 1950. It was the largest selling issue in the magazine's history.
This was a sensation. This article got press coverage all over the world. Kehoe concluded from interviewing his Air Force contacts, interviewing pilots, other credible witnesses, that flying saucers were coming to Earth, and they'd started watching us intensely because they began monitoring our atomic bombs.
In 1950, men throughout the world learned to look on the brutal face of communism. Berlin powder keg.
As the road to the Korean War became a one-way downhill street, a pillar of the community farming couple in Oregon, on a nice May evening, noticed a strange object in the sky. The pictures that Paul Trent and his wife took would be among the most highly analyzed UFO photos ever taken. And while there have been many attempts to expose them as faked, the efforts have been far from convincing. And there was also the lifelong character of the Trents.
Everybody says straightforward, honest. The chance of them making up a hoax like this is zero.
A few months later in August, in Great Falls, Montana, Nick Mariana, the general manager of the city's baseball team, shot some 16mm film of what he described as two silent, disc-like objects. Mariana showed the film around town numerous times, including at club meetings at the Park Hotel.
The little booth next is a visiting broadcast booth.
Gene Black, the son of one of the board of directors of the club, later to become the team's announcer, remembers being at a screening.
Good view, shiny, saucer-shaped things.
Though his recall is spotty after 5 decades, like others who saw the film, what impressed him was how they were stationary discs that took off at a great speed.
Hovering.
Standing still.
Yeah. But as he's standing there holding the camera, they all just started to go up very slowly. And it went.
In September, the Air Force heard about the film and asked Mariana for the footage. He was happy to oblige. In October, Project Grudge announced their photo analysts were unable to find anything of an unusual nature. Mariana, in a huff, asked for his film back. When it was returned, he claimed the first 35 frames were missing. The frames, he and others who'd seen the film said, that clearly showed two spinning disc-like objects. The Air Force denied the frames were tampered with. Mariana pointed to a splice where the leader joined the film. His splicer was perpendicular. The splice at the head of the film was diagonal. The missing frames, if Mariana and others were telling the truth, have never surfaced to this day. Around the same time that Grudge was publicly dismissing the Mariana film, a foreigner was visiting Washington with flying saucers on his mind. Wilbert Brockhouse Smith, a senior radio engineer at the Canadian Department of Transport, was attending a conference. Smith was doing research into geomagnetism and had been interested in flying saucers from the first reports in 1947. According to a confidential memo to his transport superiors that was discovered in the late 70s, Smith made discreet inquiries through the Canadian Embassy to a high-ranking U.S. Defense Research Board scientist, Dr. Robert I. Sarbucker. The memo described what he learned. The matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb. Flying saucers exist and their modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. 1951 would be a slow year for saucers, but a striking multiple radar and visual case over the New Jersey coast involved the local Air Force base at Fort Monmouth. Project Grudge was now moribund, and the commanding officer sloughed off the incident, calling it radar artifacts. When this came to light at the Pentagon, it caused a major stink. Major General Charles Cabell, the head of Air Force intelligence, went ballistic.
And he stormed around pointing at various people who were also there in his audience saying, "I've been lied to and lied to and lied to." He says, "I demand that this subject be taken seriously."
Cabell had Grudge reorganized under more open-minded officers and renamed Project Blue Book.
And at that time, probably the most sympathetic Blue Book chief at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was installed, and that was Captain Edward Ruppelt.
Ed Ruppelt was an aeronautical engineer and a good organizer. More importantly, he had a sense of history. Much of what we know about the early years comes from the book he wrote when he left the service. The New York Times, hostile to the whole idea from the start, sneered that the subject had as much reality as the Loch Ness Monster. and the first debunker appeared. Donald Menzel was a prestigious Harvard astronomer who employed all his political and media connections to discourage anyone from taking the subject seriously.
He had enough cachet as a Harvard astronomer to get into Time magazine and places like that with his idea that it was all oddball radar reflections and plasma effects and a bunch of misinterpreted nonsense.
According to Ed Ruppelt, Menzel and his strained explanations garnered little more than contempt at Air Force intelligence. They had their hands full with the practical problem. The Great Saucer Wave of 1952 had broken in June, sending everyone scurrying to keep up. Reports for the month totaled 144, the highest number ever. July would more than triple that. On July 14th, the pilot and co-pilot of a Pan Am flight off the coast of Virginia watched 6 bright orange discs flying in a line, flip on edge, get joined in their echelon by another 2 discs, and disappear off into the distance at a speed they clocked at an astounding 12,000 miles an hour. Donald Menzel would toss out many explanations for the Nash-Fortenberry incident. That old standby meteors was one. It's an interesting irony that the scientists of the 18th century couldn't accept that rocks could fall from the sky. Menzel also suggested searchlights playing on clouds, although a quick check of the weather would have shown it was a cloudless night. Then he tossed out reflections in the cockpit glass of lighted cigarettes in the passenger cabin, and finally, in what may have been a stretch for the ages, fireflies trapped between the windshield panes of glass. But the Nash-Fortenberry incident was just a harbinger of what was to come less than a week later, with a series of events that would completely change the history of the phenomenon. The midsummer of '52 was when everything changed.
We're talking about massive wave of sightings, and they were getting 20 or more sightings per day.
They are flying all up and down the East Coast, and some people actually predicted, because of the way they were doing it, that they would probably show up in Washington, D.C., and there, in the middle of July, they did.
A cluster of 7 blips 10 miles southwest of the capital was first noticed at 11:40 p.m. Saturday, July 19th, on the long-range radar at Washington National Airport. One of the operators looked out and saw a bright orange light. When the blips started showing up over the White House, Harry Barnes, the senior traffic controller, called Andrews Air Force Base 10 miles to the east. An Andrews controller was soon seeing bright orange objects flashing through the sky. As the runways at Andrews were under repair, jets would have to be dispatched from Newcastle Air Force Base, 30 minutes away in Delaware. Meanwhile, a Capital Airlines flight taking off from National was vectored towards some radar blips to the west. As they approached the area, they saw nothing unusual. Suddenly, a bluish-white light flashed in front of them on a 25-degree dive. Then another one shot from behind them, zooming up and out of sight. In the next 7 minutes, they watched 7 more lights, all being simultaneously tracked on the radar back at National. The most spectacular incident happened when National Tower informed Andrews that they had a target right over the base. The operators looked out and saw a huge, fiery orange sphere. When the jets finally arrived from Delaware, all the blips disappeared, only to return when the jets departed. Harry Barnes would later tell the newspapers that he felt the targets were somehow aware of their communications.
A little dance went on for a couple of times, and it boggled everybody's mind.
The night of Saturday, July 19th, dramatic though it was, would just be the warm-up act. The following Saturday at 9:30, both radars at Washington National and the one at Andrews started getting returns, as visual sightings poured in from all over the area. Al Chop, the public information officer at the Pentagon for UFOs, who was a confirmed skeptic when he started the job, was called out to the tower at Washington National at midnight. There was total confusion as reports of objects were coming in droves. Some of the radar blips were solid, some less so. One airline pilot, after making multiple passes over the spot he'd been vectored to, concluded the target was a riverboat plying the Potomac. 2 jets had arrived earlier, and again the objects had disappeared. Now, as CHOP was present, a second pair arrived. One was vectored to an area 10 miles out of the city, which showed radar targets. As he approached, he described 4 white glows and began to close in for a much-anticipated intercept. But as CHOP and the controllers watched on the scope, the object shot right at the jet and surrounded it. According to CHOP, the pilot radioed them for instructions asking, "What do I do now?" Then the glowing orbs zipped off. After that, Al CHOP was no longer a skeptic about UFOs. Monday's banner headline in the Washington Post caused mounting concern of a public panic. On Tuesday morning, the largest and longest Air Force press conference since the Second World War took place. The brass, all carefree smiles, suggested that a temperature inversion could have caused the radars to pick up ground vehicles as airborne objects. The majority of the media ran with this. But behind the walls of the Pentagon, in the offices of Air Force intelligence, all explanations were still very much on the table. During the height of the flap, Ed Ruppelt had taken a call from Harry Truman's military aide, General Robert B. Landry, demanding answers.
And he told them that they didn't know what they had on their hands. Well, it took Harry Truman 1 day to order Landry to go to the Joint Intelligence Committee and to order a study of this.
Aside from the question of what had just happened, the Washington flap had caused a major communications breakdown.
The hysteria, the jamming of the telephone lines, where you couldn't even call the Pentagon.
When the request at the Joint Intelligence Committee came down to take a look at UFOs, the logical place for that request to be studied was some agency other than the one studying it already, which was the Air Force. And so they picked the CIA.
Fred Durant, a rocket engineer, was in the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence.
The ball was handed to me.
Did the CIA have concerns about the competence of Blue Book?
As far as competence, well, it was obvious it did not have professional competency above an engineer.
While Ruppelt was an aeronautical engineer, he was just a lowly reserve lieutenant, and his understaffed little project was now in the glaring spotlight of the entire Cold War security apparatus. Durant and his cohorts from the CIA went to Wright Pat to examine Blue Book's methodology. After sniffing around, the CIA decided to have a scientific panel to evaluate the Air Force evidence.
CIA wanted to keep this as an internal project, which they had complete control over. So rather than going to a good high-tech science group out of which we might have gotten a rather nice estimate, again, of what the phenomena was, what happened was that they went to internal CIA consultants, the most well-known of which, and a person who had been chief consulting scientist for the CIA in the past, was a guy named Dr. Bob Robertson, H.P. Robertson, a nuclear scientist, more or less a mathematician from Caltech.
The Robertson panel met in secret over 4 days at the beginning of January 1953 and spent a total of 12 hours reviewing in depth only 8 cases of the hundreds that Blue Book had on file as unknowns. As an example of their in-depth review, they concluded that the Great Falls, Montana film, taken by Nick Mariana, was of 2 fighter jets in the area. This despite Mariana's claim he observed the jets a few minutes later. and Ed Ruppelt's reinvestigation that concluded the planes were nowhere as near Mariana as the objects on the film.
The Robertson panel report was basically there for everybody to sign the next day, and it had already been passed to the Chief of Air Force Intelligence for his approval.
The Robertson panel concluded that as reasonable explanations could be suggested for most sightings, all sightings might be explained in a similar manner. It also recommended that to eliminate national security communications problems, and the communists using UFO hysteria to their advantage, that the subject be debunked and ridiculed, so the public would no longer take it seriously.
If you wanted to eliminate a national security problem with this, you needed to change the attitude of the American public to this phenomena. And the only effective way of doing that was to make it be a joke. There was no science in this science committee report. It was all about national security.
The world's first hydrogen bomb, housed in this barn-like building, was to be exploded on a tiny target island.
In the wake of the Robertson panel's recommendations, Project Blue Book was repurposed. Its funding shrank and Ruppelt soon left the service. Blue Book continued, but its role now seemed to be to carry out the Robertson panel's recommendations and debunk UFOs. Behind the walls of the Pentagon, the extraterrestrial debate at the top levels of Air Force intelligence petered out. The Washington flap had rattled the windows in the corridors of power and raised concerns about public hysteria in the perilous times of the Cold War. A brief period of open inquiry had come to an end, and a dark curtain of denial had once again descended. In the wake of the 1966 swamp gas fiasco, the Air Force approached a number of A-list universities to conduct a serious scientific study of UFOs, and was turned down flat. Finally, the University of Colorado, running low on federal grant money, considered accepting. Heading the study would be the respected physicist Edward Condon.
Edward Condon didn't want to do this for the Air Force, even though he'd done a lot of military consultancy work before, because he was like most other people in the scientific community. He thought the whole thing was nonsense and not worth his time. But University of Colorado needed some money.
Robert Lowe, the person who would administer the project, pitched it to one of the university trustees thusly. The trick would be, to the public it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community it would present the image of a group of non-believers trying to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer.
And that was Bob Lowe, the used car salesman, saying what he had to the Board of Trustees to relax them so they could put their imprimatur on the project.
When discovered later, the memo would have disastrous consequences and convince the civilian research groups, who'd enthusiastically cooperated up to that point, that a fix was in. It turned out they were right, but not because of the Lowe memo. As the study was getting underway, Condon and Lowe met with their Air Force liaison, and incredibly they asked him what result the Air Force would like. The leaders of what's supposed to be an inquiry into the reality of UFOs, asking for direction from the agency who'd been proclaiming for 2 decades that there was absolutely no reality to them whatsoever. The liaison officer replied that the Air Force was tired of funding Project Blue Book.
And what he says to Condon is, this project has been a source of a lot of irritation, really, to the Air Force and a lot of expense. And we really need to get rid of this. And if you find that you don't have enough money to come to a proper conclusion, reapply and you'll get more money.
The Colorado study brought on board a team of 8 scientists, engineers, and psychologists. Alan Hynek consulted, as did Kehoe and NICAP, and an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arizona, Dr. James McDonald.
In 1954, he had a UFO sighting, what we would call a daylight disk, and it was really a very puzzling sighting, a good sighting, obviously a very good trained witness. But he didn't do anything with it because he was starting his scientific career.
In the mid-60s, MacDonald picked up the study of the phenomenon with a vengeance, reading through all the Blue Book files and the extensive public literature.
He went through all of this in a period of months, began talking with witnesses, was really impressed with the quality of evidence, and he thought that this was the most important overlooked scientific question of the century, maybe one of the most important of the millennium.
MacDonald was fearless, vocal, and tireless.
He began giving hundreds of talks, and I mean hundreds of talks, and a lot of scientists in these prestigious organizations began to take an open interest in the subject of UFOs.
Meanwhile, back at the University of Colorado, Condon was spending little time with the project. Instead of doing any field investigation, he was enjoying the company of contactees and regaling his professional colleagues with their absurd tales. When Jim MacDonald gave a seminar in the summer of '67, Condon fell asleep twice. That same summer, Roy Craig happened upon Lowe's trick memo in the files, the one written to sell the university trustees on the project. Disturbed, Craig showed it to Norman Levine and David Saunders, two of the project's staff who were most bothered by Condon's behavior. Saunders showed it to Kehoe, who gave it to Jim MacDonald, who mentioned it in a long letter to Lowe about the negative direction the project seemed to be taking.
Bob Lowe was very, very worried about this, but Ed Condon, typically of him, was explosive about it. He considered this to be an issue of betrayal on the part of what should be a private in-house team. And he called David Saunders and Norman Levine in, and he just fired them. And he not only fired them, but he told them that if he could, he would ruin their academic careers over this.
As threats of suits and countersuits filled the air, Lowe's assistant administrator resigned, citing an almost unanimous lack of confidence in his objectivity.
All these people are falling out of this so-called objective scientific project. They're dropping like flies. And what you have left over is Ed Condon and Roy Craig and a bunch of other people who've basically been added on at the last second, trying to cobble together a mishmash of documents that they're called the scientific study of UFOs. Well, it was a terrible piece of work.
The report was immediately hailed by the New York Times science reporter, who it turned out had already written the laudatory introduction to the paperback edition. Its 1,485 pages were prefaced by Condon's 50 pages of negative conclusions, conclusions that dismissed or ignored much of the analysis in the body of the report. Bill Hartman, extremely skeptical about UFOs, had nevertheless concluded about the Trent pictures that all factors appear to be consistent with the assertion that an extraordinary flying object flew within the sight of two witnesses.
He, in his conclusions, completely ignores talking about that, and in fact infers the opposite. No question.
Yeah, I think infers the opposite is fair. I don't know quite what to say. I think what you're saying is basically right. Whether those conclusions should have been written totally differently, I suspect they should have been. You don't write those things without sort of knowing what the consequence is going to be for people at his level. And I don't know, maybe he's just even more deviously canny than I'm saying, because maybe he just figures, well, if I, Edward Condon, say there's nothing here in this report, nobody will bother to go any further.
Both MacDonald and Alan Hynek fought tenaciously against the acceptance of Condon's conclusions within the scientific community, but it was a losing battle. The Air Force shut down Blue Book, and Kehoe's NICAP went into a steep membership decline. MacDonald sunk into a depression from marital problems and would soon take his own life. Hynek soldiered on, founding the Center for UFO Studies, but the ground was shifting in a fundamental way.
As proof of the extraterrestrial hypothesis remained elusive, some ufologists began to look in other directions.
As the late 60s saw the planet as a whole, undivided by artificial boundaries, The decade had also brought into the culture the Eastern notion of expanded consciousness, and tagging along its frequent fellow travelers, the paranormal and the occult.
In 1969, Jacques Vallée wrote a book called Passport to Magonia, where he links modern UFOs to traditional beliefs about fairies, demons, gods, entities of various kinds.
Jacques Vallée had been one of Allen Hynek's graduate astronomy students, and Vallée's influence had been one of the reasons for Hynek's change of heart on UFOs. In his new book, Vallée pointed out that the reports of fairy encounters of yore and modern UFO occupant reports had many qualities in common. In Europe, many researchers embraced this idea, that UFOs were the modern face of an old phenomenon, one that was psychosocial in nature, not extraterrestrial.
The whole premise was that these things couldn't be happening. This was implicit. It was really the debunking view by another more pretentious name. And so there was this great effort to study the most extreme kinds of experiential claims, and without really much empirical investigation or documentation, just claiming that by their nature they were explainable as the witnesses' deep-seated psychological or spiritual needs, often ascribed to witnesses that the writers had never met and knew nothing about except what they had reported.
As if to offset all this armchair theorizing, 1973 saw a massive UFO wave. In one spectacular episode, 4 Ohio National Guardsmen reported narrowly averting a collision with an object that stopped for a few seconds above them.
It was so close to us. At that time, I was concerned that we might have a blade strike because I could see the tips of the rotor blades reflecting off the light, and it was awful close to that. And it was, as they say, this big thing in front of us, big black solid thing, because the stars were gone in front of us. I don't know, I'm guessing 80 feet maybe long.
What were you thinking when you looked at it?
I was awestruck.
The entire event was observed by a family on the ground. Philip J. Klass, an aviation journalist and the arch UFO skeptic now that Donald Menzel had retired, explained that what the guardsmen saw was a slow-moving meteor.
That's worse than swamp. That's worse than swamp gas.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon.
But as the times grew in uncertainty, so it seemed did the will to believe in cause and effect connections that strained facts, especially archaeological ones.
Harvey Ludd didn't know about astronauts, but we do.
The 1974 documentary Chariots of the Gods popularized the notion that the mysterious wonders of the ancient world were attributable to alien astronauts. The film grossed $25 million.
The giant drawings must have been made for someone arriving by air.
But if extraterrestrials had made contact with our primitive ancestors, they remain stubbornly aloof from us, except apparently in rare incidents. One in particular that revealed that a face-to-face encounter with an advanced non-human intelligence might have profoundly disturbing undercurrents. Toward the end of 1975, in the forests of northern Arizona, a truck carrying home 6 loggers stopped when they noticed a glowing object in a clearing. Travis Walton jumped out and walked towards it. His friends told the police that they took off in fright when they saw him knocked flying by a bright blue flash, and that when they returned 15 minutes later, he was gone and so was the object. 5 days later, a shaken and dazed Travis Walton called from a roadside phone. He didn't remember much about what happened, but he would never forget the moments after he regained consciousness.
I was in a lot of pain, and I didn't remember what had happened at first. But then that kind of came back to me, but I still didn't put it together with where I was. I was thinking that I'd been hurt and they'd taken me to a hospital, and that, you know, that's where I was, that there's sounds of movement around me, that these were doctors, and, you know, things were under control. there was some sort of a device pressing down on my chest. And, you know, all of the pain and everything made me feel like I just better stay still because, you know, that's what you do in a situation when you're being treated. Right. But I don't think I was being treated. When I finally, you know, could focus my eyes and saw, you know, where I was and saw these creatures, just to look into the eyes of something, a thinking creature that wasn't human. It was just, it was a shock that, you know, that instant is something that'll never leave me.
By the late 70s, requests made under the new U.S. Freedom of Information Act were revealing a fascinating series of incidents at Minuteman missile bases along the U.S.-Canada border, and showing that despite the end of Project Blue Book, the Air Force continued to investigate UFO reports involving its personnel and facilities. It was a period of flux, when the modern history of the phenomenon was about to make a radical course change. The fateful moment arrived as a tip from a television station manager.
Out of the blue, he says, you know, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And brilliant investigator that I am, I said, who's he? And he says, oh, he handled the wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in. He was in the military. What?
The events related by Major Jesse Marcel, retired, former intelligence officer of the 509th Atomic Bomb Wing at Roswell, New Mexico, would provide the seed for a crashed saucer story that would take root and grow like an enormous weed to overrun the UFO landscape. Witnesses were discovered who reported a massive recovery operation. More witnesses came forward claiming they saw wreckage and bodies.
By 1980, we talked to 62 people. By 85, it was 92 people.
Around the same time, the memo that Wilbert Smith wrote to his superiors in Ottawa back in 1950 was discovered in his papers. The one reporting on his conversation with Defense Research Board scientist Dr. Robert Sarbucker that a crashed saucer was being analyzed by a small group of top-level scientists led by Defense Research Board Chief Vannevar Bush. Sarbucker was still alive, and when contacted, he confirmed the contents of the Smith memo. It seemed that a cover-up was finally beginning to unravel. Then, in the mid-'80s,
documents began to appear, documents of unknown provenance, for the most part.
The MJ-12 documents seemed to confirm the Roswell crash in the New Mexico desert. They purported to be an eyes-only briefing given in 1952 to Dwight Eisenhower about Operation Majestic 12, an above top-secret project dealing with crashed saucers and their occupants. Prominently mentioned was Dr. Vannevar Bush, thus seeming to confirm Wilbert Smith's memo. Also present others who weighed heavily in the history of the phenomenon, including the arch-debunker Dr. Donald Menzel, confirming many a UFO researcher's suspicion that debunkers are really government agents. Also looking for coded messages from the stars, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI projects, were getting underway. One of the major objections by the scientific community to the idea of flying saucers zipping around our planet was the limiting factor of the speed of light, a consequence of Einstein's special theory of relativity. If nothing could travel faster than light, a jaunt to just the nearest star would take an absolute minimum of 4.5 years. Therefore, scientists reasoned that if anyone traveled the vast distances, even in our local neighborhood, it would be very rarely. And it wouldn't look like the seeming traffic jam being reported. So SETI project started up with the idea that smart aliens would stay home and contact us by an interstellar version of an inexpensive long-distance card. Of course, all this assumes that the speed of light cannot be sidestepped in ways unknown to our present physics. Given the ever-changing history of physical laws over the last few hundred years, that assumption would appear to be more a leap of faith than science.
It's also part of the in-training of a scientist to set borders on what that scientist believes is the nature of reality. And it's a lot more comfortable if you have the arrogance that you think you're going to explain everything sooner or later, to have a rather narrow set of fences.
The early 90s saw growing media fascination with the Roswell incident. New Mexico House Representative Stephen Schiff asked the Air Force about it and hit a bureaucratic stone wall. Annoyed by the lack of response, he requested the General Accounting Office to investigate Air Force communications in and out of Roswell in 1947. The Air Force subsequently decided to conduct their own inquiry.
First of all, the report was prepared by counterintelligence people within the Air Force. It's a case of the fox, guarding the hen house, I think.
The Air Force report was prepared by the same Pentagon personnel that many researchers believe had authored the MJ-12 documents. Its 998 pages concluded that there was indeed a cover-up, but it was only of debris from a secret Project Mogul balloon launch that had gone missing. Moguls were huge balloon assemblies intended to explore the possibility of remotely monitoring Soviet A-bomb tests. But there were multiple problems with the explanation. First of all, there was no definitive evidence outside of one scientist's 50-year-old memory that the particular Mogul launch had ever taken place. And then, even leaving aside the multiple witness testimony about the unearthly nature of the material recovered, the apparent size and secrecy of the recovery operation itself, and the reported threats made to witnesses about keeping silent, there remained the simple fact that Mogul assemblies were mostly weather balloons, tinfoil, and balsa wood. So how would the chief intelligence officer, as well as the base commander, mistake such mundane material and announce it to the world as a flying saucer? Also somewhat damning was that the General Accounting Office found that all communications in and out of the Roswell base for the period had been destroyed without authorization. But as there was no smoking gun, Roswell would remain a mystery. Today, if the interpretations of the UFO phenomenon have changed dramatically since 1947, they still seem to be defined by those ancient catalysts of myth, fear and hope. And if the major media now mostly ignore the subject, the internet boils over with it. Tens of millions of hits on UFOs will bring up countless photos and videos, and the conspiracy wrinkle of the moment. There's little doubt that fringe mythology now obscures the actual phenomenon, marginalizing it more than at any time in its history. So even though people continue to see the same things in the sky, and surveys show that half the population believe we're being visited, there remains little possibility that a serious scientific study will take up the question.
We in academia have it made, after all. Especially scientists in academia. We're kind of at the top of the pecking order. And in order to maintain that illusion, which is what it is, we've got to not appear the fool. So the majority of the scientific community is a very non-risk-taking group of people that live in a rather small reality and are in fact scared of things which seem to be outside that reality.
The reality, almost never mentioned with this subject, is that our universe is 13.7 billion years old, and our solar system formed only 4.6 billion years ago. That makes us, in all probability, the new kids on a very old block. In all likelihood, the first advanced intelligence in our galaxy has at least a few billion years head start on us. In other words, the version of contact that we typically imagine, the version that has us as more or less equal, is almost certainly a myth we create to shield us from a reality that is beyond our ability to understand. The belief by many that if we're being visited, they'd stop by and say hello may make about as much sense as us leaning over an anthill and saying, "Take me to your leader." In this light, the suggestion that a far more advanced intelligence might create an intermediate hybrid race to communicate with or to absorb an emerging civilization is an idea hardly less reasonable than any other.
We lived our little drama.
Still, it may turn out that the debunkers are right. The unknown objects flying around our atmosphere just mistaken identity, the wishful thinking of our race as it looks out on a vast mystery. But of the countless thousands of reports worldwide since 1947, there are at least many hundreds that are strongly compelling. Multiple observers, simultaneous instrument trackings, performance that defies our understanding of physics. Are all of them just the mythic projection of our hopes and fears? Our unconscious way of seeing our meaning in a universe that seems indifferent to our presence?
And in the center, just you and me.
Or are they a mysterious reality from which our myths take root and grow and lead us onward towards our destiny? Though I've never seen anything that's unambiguously a UFO, after spending a few years on this, I'd say if some of these things are not someone from somewhere else, you could blow me over with a feather. I'm still standing.